Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, no refugees allowed in the United States, unless you're a white South African.
So to suddenly hear that a country like the United States is offering us refugee status was a really big deal. And I was so excited. I felt so relieved.
How white South African farmers became Trump's model minority. I'm Manuel Rápalo, and this is The Take. Since the Trump administration's return to power, we've heard promises to pull back from global entanglements and focus on domestic priorities. But South Africa has become an unexpected flashpoint in U.S. policy, specifically its white minority.
It's a genocide that's taking place that you people don't want to write about, but it's a terrible thing that's taking place. And farmers are being killed. They happen to be white.
Trump claims a genocide is happening against whites. That's a debunked conspiracy theory. But the right-wing fixation on the plight of white South Africans culminated in 59 of them arriving in the United States as refugees this month.
Welcome to the United States of America. Thank you, sir. It is such an honor for us to receive you here today. This is the land of the free.
Today, we're joined by a journalist who has already been following this from Cape Town.
My name is Joseph Dana. I'm a writer, and I'm located in Cape Town, South Africa.
Joseph, welcome to The Take. You're here to help us unpack why South Africa has become a symbol of a broader ideological war. What has the reaction to all of this been in South Africa?
Well, the reaction has been one of surprise and deep concern. I think overall in the society, a lot of people are wondering why South Africa is being singled out in the way that it's being singled out. It's not every day that the global superpower kind of turns its nose down on you and says, you guys are doing a really bad job. South Africa has very warm relations through the BRICS alliance with China, with Russia, with South American countries, and it has been pursuing that path in diplomatic and economic avenues, much to the ire of the Americans. And then when Trump came in, I think a lot of people were holding their breath to see how he would handle those issues. However, there was a lot of surprise that he went straight to this issue of Afrikaners and the white minority in South Africa and these claims about genocide.
Wherever they feel that their financial interests are being threatened, you would expect Trump to act in this particular manner. But we thought maybe one is giving him too much credit. We thought at the very least he was going to use diplomatic channels and not behave like a primary school boy.
Before we get into these larger attitudes in terms of the global economy, there are all these terms now that Americans maybe hadn't heard before and now have very strong opinions on, not least of which is white South Africans versus Afrikaners. Before we go on, can you briefly break down these terms for us? White South Africans, Afrikaners, who's included in that group? What do these terms mean?
Well, South Africa is a predominantly Black African country, but inside of the country, there are a lot of minorities, one of which is the white minority. And inside of the white minority, you essentially have two groups. You have white people claiming English descent, and then you have white people claiming Dutch descent. And that evolved into its own minority group called the Afrikaners. And they speak of kind of a version of Dutch, a simple Dutch, that is Afrikaans, and they are most closely associated with the creation and the maintenance of the apartheid regime. And right now, in a country of more than 55 million people, the Afrikaner minority is about 2.7 million, or roughly thereabouts.
In February, Trump issued an executive order that called for the US to resettle Afrikaner refugees. The assertion that minority white South Africans face discrimination from the black majority has spread in far-right circles for years, and been echoed by Trump's white South African-born ally, Elon Musk.
How did South Africa become such a source of fascination for right-wing conservatives here in the United States?
That's a really good question, and it is a deep source of right-wing fascination, not just in the United States, but around the world. And a big reason for that is that the apartheid regime, the minority government that ruled this country, in many ways represented an ideal of more far-right groups around the world. And the collapse of that regime and the replacement of that regime with a democratic country, and replacing that conservative and aggressively right-wing minority government with something more holistic and egalitarian and open, in many ways has become a warning. And I think that's what you see now, especially in the United States, when it comes to the debate about woke politics and things like that Trump really came into power on. I think a simplistic way of saying this would be, in the right-wing imagination of woke politics gone wild, you would have essentially democratic South Africa. And therefore, this country has been singled out for a certain amount of punishment.
It's amazing witnessing all of this play out here from the perspective of someone inside the United States, because there are so many strong opinions being voiced here. I want to read you a quote by one right-wing media personality here in the United States. His name is Ben Shapiro, who said,
again, this is the great danger of these sort of racial reparations logic that you've seen people try to enforce in the United States too. This is what so much of Black Lives Matter was about. And the idea was that America needed to enact its own system of racial preferences as a reparative to the sins of the past. And what you end up with is actual sins of the present in order to try and react to the sins of the past.
how do you respond to some of these very, very strong opinions coming from the other side of the world?
Well, look, that's a much more articulate way of putting that kind of racist sentiment into words, the way that Ben Shapiro put it into words there. As I said, the right wing, the kind of anti-woke right wing section of American politics looks at South Africa as a cause that was lost. They don't like to talk about the actual brutality of the apartheid regime or the actual reality of the economic apartheid that still exists in South Africa. And now they see different laws. There's a number of economic laws that exist in this country in terms of how many people need to be hired for certain jobs. And this represents in many ways the worst case scenario for their vision of the United States. And that's why they're so concerned and obsessed with it.
And there's one policy in particular that the conservative right has really honed in on, which is this land redistribution policy.
The president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has begun, and you may have seen this in the press, seizing land from his own citizens without compensation because they are the wrong skin color. That is literally the definition of racism. Racism is what our elites say they dislike most.
What exactly is this policy about? Why has it become such a flashpoint among the right?
Well, with many of these flashpoints, the rhetoric and the reality, there's a big gulf. Many countries around the world, including the United States, have an eminent domain provision whereby the government can seize different lands for public usage. It is part of a basket of legal measures that the democratic governments in South Africa inherited from the apartheid regime. They haven't used it in nearly the same way that the apartheid government used it. And we do have to be very careful in how we describe it because, people in the United States or the United Kingdom or Australia are familiar with eminent domain privileges that governments take. If the government of Los Angeles wants to build a highway and it goes through someone's backyard, they have the ability to come in and say, we are going to expropriate this land at fair compensation. The idea that there's going to be no compensation has really been debunked in the current usage of that law. In South Africa, this has become a very contentious issue because a similar issue existed in Zimbabwe. And the Zimbabwean government has used it aggressively to expropriate land, specifically farming land, from white Zimbabweans without compensation. What exists in South Africa is not the same thing.
I want to back up a little bit, Joseph. I know that you've already touched on this, but just for the sake of clarity, was land redistribution a promise made to Black South Africans after apartheid?
Yeah, well, that has been one of the major debates about the settlement of the apartheid situation, and it hasn't been resolved. And so land has been incredibly an incredibly contentious issue that has been promised by various politicians and is still going on today. And anyone that's done a little bit of basic research into South Africa will know that upwards of 70% of the of land is still in white minority hands.
Obviously, there's nuance to the conversation over the land redistribution policy. I don't think there's much nuance to the debunked conspiracy theories of a white genocide taking place. But I do want to ask you about a popular phrase that I noticed on South African social media, which is this phrase that is, quote, "kill the Boer," which refers specifically to white farmers. Isn't that a source for concern? Isn't that kind of something that would ring alarm bells, though?
Absolutely. I mean, there's nationalist rhetoric on all sides of the political spectrum. That phrase has become very popular from one specific party in South Africa, which is known as the Economic Freedom Fighters, a very far left party that is very interested in nationalization of state institutions and banks and all of these types of things, and probably expropriation without compensation in the way that the right wing dreams that it's actually happening. And they've popularized that phrase for their own political theater, right? Political theater exists on all sides. So I think that it is very concerning that people are using any form of nationalist, racist rhetoric.
And Joseph, there are a couple of figures that are really shaping the way that this narrative is playing out, both in South Africa and in the United States and the rest of the world in different ways. I'm talking about Elon Musk and Peter Thiel. What can you tell us about the kind of upbringing that Elon Musk, Peter Thiel had growing up in South Africa that helped form their worldview and the way that they see South Africa today?
It's a really interesting question that I don't think gets enough attention, specifically in the U.S. press. Elon Musk is really the person to talk to or to talk about in this situation. He was born in Pretoria. He was raised in South Africa, and his family eventually fled the country after the fall of apartheid. And that experience shaped deeply his understanding of how the economy works, and it also gave him a certain amount of privilege. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about his grandfather, who was a very kind of notorious anti-Semite in Canada, who eventually fled to South Africa to specifically be part of the apartheid regime, and his father, who's said very horrific racial comments in the media. Musk himself hasn't really gone into that territory, but what we do know is that he was raised in a situation of privilege that few people can understand in terms of how apartheid existed, right? I mean, he was raised as part of a minority that was governing over an extremely wealthy country that was keeping large portions of that country really in a dire situation simply because of the color of their skin. Peter Thiel, on the other hand, is a little different. He wasn't born in South Africa. He's not South African. He spent a good deal of his childhood in Johannesburg, and he's come out very explicitly in several books that he's written along with other South Africans, such as David Sachs, who's a very big and important person in the United States right now, and said that he thinks that apartheid, he's gone on record to say that apartheid was actually a sound economic structure, and that claims of its brutality and its criminal nature are in fact overblown.
And these are guys that are pretty influential. Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, how do their worldviews influence the larger global agenda of right-wing conservative movements around the world?
I think that they have a very big role to play, especially Elon Musk. His comments about South Africa, his comments about specifically about how the economy is structured now. He's been on record about bringing Starlink to South Africa, and he refuses because the government has a law that a certain number of Black South Africans must be part of any company structure. This is an example of everything that he is against. And so by saying that he lived here and that he had to leave, he has a certain, almost as if he was a foot soldier in some sort of war, a certain gravitas that he can say that he's experienced this, and he knows how bad things can get if he doesn't get his way, or if his vision of a kind of anti-woke economic libertarian kind of system.
More with Joseph Dana after the break. Joseph, let's get back to the political obsession here. There's clearly, as you said, a lot of political theater playing out. It feels like a good time to bring up the point that the Trump administration is accusing South Africa, essentially, of doing exactly what South Africa is accusing Israel of doing on a global stage: genocide.
South Africa had hoped, when we last appeared before this court, to halt this genocidal process, to preserve Palestine and its people. Instead, Israel's genocide has continued apace.
Is this a coincidence?
It's absolutely not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence in any sort of way. And to be honest with you, it's a real, I think he's doing a real disservice to the term genocide by using the label genocide against white South Africans in this country. There is nothing anywhere close to a genocide happening in this country. If you step back and just think about things logically, it's a very bad hand to play. I was thinking about this today and watching the news of the first Afrikaners to go to the United States as refugees. Roughly 57 people have gone to the United States on a private chartered jet. They couldn't even fill a jet with people to go to the U.S. And if a genocide was happening in this country against 2.7 million people, you would think they would at least be able to fill a jet with victims fleeing such a horrible situation, right? And it also struck me that there are several flights a day, direct flights to the United States. I take them to visit my family from Cape Town and Johannesburg. These are not planes full of genocide survivors. And so just the basic logic of the argument that there's a genocide happening here is absurd. I mean, could you imagine if there was direct flights on United from Gaza City to Washington? I can guarantee you those flights would be full. People would be leaving that war zone. You don't have that here.
Let's talk about the sort of economic geopolitics being played out here, because South Africa is a member of BRICS, which is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and the S is for South Africa, of course. How are you interpreting the geopolitical strategy here that we're seeing playing out in real time?
I see the United States sending a very clear message to South Africa. What's really happening behind the scenes is very serious economic weapons that the United States is using. And that's an incredibly important aspect of the larger geopolitical debate, is that when push comes to shove, the South African economy is very connected and dependent on the American economy. And as such, America has certain free trade agreements and other agreements that it can leverage to inflict real pain if South Africa makes political decisions that Washington doesn't like. I think what's going on, broadly speaking, is that the United States is angry with how South Africa is behaving. It's angry with its involvement in BRICS. It's been very angry with its kind of neutral position in the Ukraine conflict and its warm relations with Russia. Several Russian naval ships have docked just in Simonstown, which is about 10 minutes from where I am. And that has been a cause of deep concern from the American diplomatic corps. And so all of this is kind of coming to a head now. And what we're going to see is more economic pain. Now, I should say, some of it has been blunted, ironically, through Trump's larger economic pain that he's inflicting on the entire world. And so his tariff structure has taken the edge off of the specifics of what's happening in South Africa. But as that tariff debacle seems to calm down, maybe it will, maybe it won't, then we'll start to see the real push from the Americans when it comes to how much they want to go after South Africa.
Is it creating any unity in South Africa, do you think?
I do think it's creating a little bit of unity. South Africa is at a really unusual political juncture. For the first time in its democratic history, there is a unity government that incorporates the predominantly white Democratic Alliance opposition party with the ANC in a governing structure. And I think that this attack by the United States, and I will call it an attack because it does have elements of an attack, at least from the economic perspective, is bringing certain officials inside the government together. And I think there's just a lot of people in South Africa that are generally scratching their heads together, trying to make sense at why this is happening from the United States and why possibly they'd be using this aggressive language of genocide.
And that's, I think, the absurdity that a lot of folks don't realize when we're talking about this, because the accusations are very serious. These are words that shouldn't be used lightly, genocide. But then you see South African social media, and a lot of folks are poking fun at this group that came to the United States, saying that it's only a matter of time before they start figuring out a way to just head right back to South Africa.
Yeah, I'm very fascinated by Afrikaans TikTok. There's a whole lane of TikTok with some great Afrikaans content, and I've seen since this first plane of it's very hard to call them refugees, but let's use that term. So this first plane of refugees landed in the United States. There's just loads of content saying, oh yeah, how long before you get it back, and what's it going to be like living in the United States without biltong, or without your nanny, or without your gardener.
Do you have any dependents? I don't have any dependents, but I am dependent on Mandisa, my domestic workers.
Which does demonstrate that certain economic power that they still hold. And, I'm not making a judgment on whether or not that's good or bad. It is a reality in this country that the legacy of apartheid is an economic legacy, and economic apartheid still exists in this country. And that's also something that makes it a little absurd when you look at the right-wing debate that we've been talking about, in which, if you were to ask Peter Thiel or Elon Musk what's going on in South Africa, they would say, well, apartheid is over and this woke government has redistributed everything. And it's not nearly what is going on at all. Economic apartheid exists very firmly in this society, and it is a deep and structural problem, a long tail of one of the 20th century's most vicious regimes, and it's still being worked out.
And that's The Take. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to give it a like so more people can find this episode. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what stood out to you, or if there's anything you'd like us to dive deeper into next time. I'm always checking in, so let's keep the conversation going. See you tomorrow.